It is 1 o'clock in the morning on the 2nd of October 1996, and over the Pacific Ocean, around 50 nautical miles west of Lima in Peru, it's calm and peaceful. A gibbous moon in the northeast illuminates a smooth, unbroken cloud layer where the elegant silhouette of an Aeroperú Boeing 757 completes the scene perfectly as it's climbing slowly northwards. But this peaceful appearance stands in sharp contrast to what's going on in the cockpit, where its two pilots are now trying to deal with one of the most insidious failures that we can ever face. And while I know that what I'm about to tell you will be hugely frustrating, it is important to remember one thing. Anyone who knows how a magic trick works will think that it is obvious, but for those who sees it for the first time, it's almost impossible to figure out. Now, the two pilots who will play the main characters in this story were both highly experienced. The captain, aged 58, had accumulated almost 22,000 total hours, including over 1,500 hours on the Boeing 757. And his 42-year-old first officer had close to 8,000 hours, including around 700 on the same type. But despite this story will circle around two very basic parameters: how high and how fast they were flying. It all began in the evening before the flight with November 52 Alpha Whiskey, one of two Boeing 757-200s operated by Aeroperú. The 757 is a medium to long-range, narrow-body twin-engine jet built between 1982 and 2004, and it's equipped with a modern glass cockpit. With its two powerful engines and high reliability, it is and was hugely popular with every pilot that I've ever spoken to who flew it, and even though I have not flown it in real life myself, I have some simulator experience on it, and it is a truly wonderful machine. Anyway, November 52 Alpha Whiskey was only 4 years old at the time, which meant that it was practically new, and on this night it had been scheduled to complete the final Lima to Santiago sector of Flight 603, which was one of Aeroperú's signature routes, connecting Miami with Santiago in Chile through intermediate stops in Quito in Ecuador and Lima. Aeroperú's other Boeing 757 had operated the first two sectors carrying 180 passengers, and for 119 of them, Lima would be their final destination, whilst 61 would continue on to Santiago using this new aircraft under the same flight number. This meant that together with the two pilots and the 7 cabin crew members who would start their duty with this sector, there would be a total of 70 souls on board. Now, whilst the passengers were still en route from Miami, Aeroperú maintenance technicians had worked on replacing 2 inlet guide vanes on one of November 52 Alpha Whiskey's Pratt & Whitney turbofan engines, which had been damaged by a bird strike, and they had also changed one of its engine-driven hydraulic pumps. The aircraft had then been scheduled to be washed and get the aluminium finish on the lower forward part of its fuselage polished, but after that wash had been started, it then had to be temporarily interrupted by a mandatory engine run-up, and likely that's where the first piece of this puzzle was laid. But when the crew eventually arrived to the aircraft and the captain performed his walk-around, all the maintenance tasks and washing had been completed, and he didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Now, as I hinted to in the beginning, this story will ultimately be about speed and altitude, so to fully understand what was now about to happen, I need to first explain how these two parameters are measured, since I know that there are some confusion on this subject. Both speed and altitude can be expressed in relation to the ground, in which case they are called ground speed and height, but whilst it might seem important to know how fast an aircraft is moving relative to the ground or how high it is above a mountain, those are not the primary references used by us pilots. You see, we fly through and in relation to the air, and that is therefore the primary reference that we use for both speed and altitude. And measuring the speed of an aircraft in relation to the surrounding air is actually not that complicated. Like every other commercial aircraft, the Boeing 757 uses something known as pitot tubes to do this. These are named after the French scientist Henri Pitot, who developed them back in 1732 in order to measure the velocity of water flowing in rivers and canals. He made these tubes so that they had an opening positioned against the current in order to allow water flowing into them to exert a measurable pressure against the sealed end of the tubes. And this would then show the so-called total pressure from which the ambient pressure of the surrounding water, also known as static pressure, was subtracted to yield the dynamic pressure, which was perfectly proportional to the speed of the flowing water. This meant the higher the dynamic pressure, the faster the water was flowing. Now, the Boeing 757 is equipped with 3 of these pitot tubes located on the side of the aircraft's nose below the cockpit, and just like in Monsieur Pitot's rivers, they measure the total pressure, not of water, but of the air streaming into them. And that information is then fed into air data computers, where the ambient static pressure is subtracted from the airspeed as a function of the dynamic or ram air pressure, as it's also known. The altitude can be measured even more simply by using the principle of a barometer, which takes its name from the Greek word baros, meaning weight. A barometer measures the weight of the air above it, which is another way of saying that it measures the static pressure, using a small evacuated metal drum called an aneroid capsule. The higher the altitude, the lighter the weight of the air above it, so in a climb the capsule slowly expands, and if you then connect it to a mechanism that transfers this expansion to a pointer on a dial, you have a basic altimeter. Which is actually how many standby altimeters worked in the cockpits of 90s era airliners, some of which are still in use today. But this only works if the static pressure can flow freely into and out of its related sensor. Now, while pitot tubes are easy to spot on an aircraft, it can be a bit harder to identify where the static pressure is sensed. On the Boeing 757, the so-called static ports are flush plate-style ports that are perforated like salt shakers and set into both sides of the forward fuselage, low down below the cockpit and forward cabin windows. They are positioned there because this part of the forward fuselage is a relatively neutral pressure zone, where the local pressure of the air passing over the skin is closest to the true ambient static pressure. Now, in addition to speed and altitude, we also measure a third component parameter from this system, which is called vertical speed. And as the name might suggest, this is a measure of how quickly an aircraft is climbing or descending. Vertical speed is computed as a function of the rate of change of static pressure, so as in both speed and altitude measuring, the static pressure again plays an important role here, and that is worth remembering. And when we're on the subject of things that plays important roles, most people take their personal safety quite seriously, but for some reason they don't tend to think of their online security in the same way. Every time you connect to the internet, you're leaving a trail of the sites you visit, the files you download and the links you click on behind you, and luckily most of the time, nothing really happens. But it only takes one convincing scam or infected file to cause some real damage. That's why it is so great that today's sponsor NordVPN has just launched their next generation antivirus software, which can help you keep your digital life private and safe, no matter what sites you visit. Traditional antivirus were built for a different era, designed to catch threats after they have already landed on the device, but that also then means that by the time you react, you have already been exposed. In this AI-driven world, that just doesn't cut it anymore. So instead, NordVPN's antivirus works in the background, automatically scanning the sites you visit, proactively alerting you about any scams and phishing sites, as well as intercepting trackers and corrupted files before they even get close to your device. Now, you can protect up to 10 different devices on one single account, so your whole family can stay safe and anonymous online. And if that sounds interesting, then scan this QR code or head over to nordvpn.com/pilot to grab 4 extra months for free when you sign up for their 2-year plan. Also, remember that with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee, you lose nothing by trying it out. Thank you, Nord. Now let's get back to the flight. In any case, despite the maintenance work that had been carried out, November 5-2 Alpha Whiskey was, like I mentioned, fully ready in time for Flight 603's scheduled departure. So, after briefing the cabin crew, the pilots began their cockpit preparation for what they expected to be a normal, pleasant flight on a serene night in what was early spring in the southern hemisphere. They had earlier agreed that the first officer would be the pilot flying for this first leg, while the captain would be pilot monitoring. So, once all of the preparations had been completed, they started up their engines and taxied out towards the holding point for runway 15. Air traffic control then assigned them with a transponder code and instructed them to climb via the ARPON-1 standard departure up to 29,000 feet initially, and up until this point everything looked completely bog standard. So, at 41 minutes past midnight local time, Lima Tower cleared Aeroperú Flight 603 for takeoff, which also coincided with the exact takeoff time specified in their flight plan, which prompted the captain to exclaim, "Ha, what precision!" He then handed the controls over to the first officer, who slowly advanced the thrust levers, spooling up the two powerful Pratt & Whitney engines to their calculated takeoff thrust, and he then called out, "Power set." Now, with only 61 passengers and fuel for a flight of about 3.5 hours on board, the Boeing 757 was well below its maximum takeoff weight, so it now accelerated quickly down the runway, and after just about 13 seconds, the captain called out, "V1" and "rotate." This was then followed by the first officer pulling back on his control yoke, rotating the aircraft around its pitch axis, which then lifted the huge 757 off the runway. All indications still looked perfectly normal, so the captain soon called out V2 as the safe takeoff climb speed was reached, and that was then followed by positive, indicating that the aircraft had a positive rate of climb and that it was therefore safe to retract the landing gear. Now, once the landing gear is retracted and the gear doors have closed, the aircraft becomes almost magically quiet, except for the muted roar of the engines powering it smoothly up into the sky. So, if I put myself in the shoes of these two pilots for a moment, I can almost guarantee that they were thoroughly enjoying this light takeoff in their almost brand new modern Boeing 757 up until this point. But that feeling was cut brutally short when, just a few seconds after the captain had selected the gear lever to up, the first officer called out, "The altimeters are stuck!" And that was then followed by a loud synthetic voice warning calling out,
"Wind shear! Wind shear! Wind shear!"
Something that, given the excellent weather conditions on that night, just couldn't be real. But at the same time, this was more than just a nuisance warning. You see, the wind shear warning system uses a complex algorithm that compares the aircraft's kinetic energy with aerodynamic parameters, like its vertical speed and indicated airspeed. So if the indicated airspeed were to drop suddenly whilst the inertial reference system didn't sense an immediate change in the flight path, this would point to a sudden change in wind direction, from a headwind to a strong tailwind, for example, which in turn could instantly rob the aircraft of a significant amount of its energy, possibly leading to an unrecoverable stall, which again made absolutely no sense here since the winds were almost calm. But the system had sensed an abnormal drop in indicated airspeed, so from the perspective of its algorithm, it had triggered the warning correctly. The problem, though, was that the airspeed drop was not real, and together with the frozen altimeters, this all now pointed to a total corruption of the aircraft's aerodynamic sensor system. So, how could a completely normal takeoff suddenly turn into a cacophony of false warnings and faulty indications? Well, as I alluded to earlier, the aircraft had been washed while it was on the ground in Lima, most likely to remove the remnants of that bird strike that I mentioned before. Now, when an aircraft is washed, it is standard procedure to cover pitot tubes and static ports to protect them from corrosive cleaning agents. And those covers are usually red, or have red flags attached to them to make sure that they are easy to spot and remove before flight. But while that was true for the pitot tubes, Boeing hadn't provided any specific covers for the static ports on the 757, so instead, the maintenance manual specified that moisture-resistant paper should be taped over them, with no requirement for that paper to have any attention-grabbing color. This meant that before the aircraft was washed, a maintenance technician had covered all the static ports with strips of adhesive tape, which were almost the same color as the polished aluminium around it, and he had then forgotten to remove them. In itself, this wouldn't necessarily have led to severe consequences, because after the wash, an inspection should have been conducted by another technician, followed by a review of the shift supervisor and a sign-off by the line maintenance chief. But as we often see in Dr. Reason's Swiss cheese model, on this particular day, the holes in the cheese slices had lined up perfectly, so no one, not even the captain during his walk-around, had noticed the metal-colored strips of tape blocking all static ports, which would effectively blind the aircraft's critical air data system. Today, air data system faults leading to unreliable airspeed scenarios are trained frequently, but the blockage of all static ports is still regarded as a worst-case scenario since it can be quite tricky to diagnose. That's because all airspeed indicators and altimeters might show the same or very similar faulty information. And another reason for this particular issue to be so frustrating is that it is often completely hidden on the ground. So, during the takeoff, all indications appear normal since the static pressure remains the same. But once the aircraft starts to climb, the air inside the static lines become trapped, causing the measured static value to remain at ground level. And this then leads to the altimeters and vertical speed indicators freezing immediately after takeoff, which was exactly what had now happened on board Aeroperú Flight 603. When the first officer called out, "The altimeters are stuck! All of them!" the captain replied, "This is really new. Keep V2 plus 10. V2 plus 10, which was a safe speed for their initial climb. But just a few seconds later, the degradation of their air data system then went even further, causing the next issue. Remember how the pressure of the air streaming into the pitot tubes consists of the dynamic or ram air part and the static part, with the sum being called total pressure? Well, to get the ram air part, which is our indicated airspeed, the static part therefore has to be subtracted, and as the aircraft climbs, the static pressure outside generally decreases, which is picked up by the static ports. This means that the value to be subtracted from the total pressure is getting smaller as we climb higher, keeping a correct relation between the static pressure and the dynamic pressure, and therefore giving us the correct airspeed. But if an aircraft climbs with a pocket of air with ground static pressure trapped in the system, that part becomes increasingly overrepresented in the equation, eventually overpowering the dynamic part, resulting in an apparent airspeed indication that decreases with altitude and can even reduce down to zero. So that now became the next, not very obvious problem, which was also confirmed by the communication recorded on the cockpit voice recorder. About 10 seconds after his first advisory about the speed, the captain repeated, "V2 plus 10, V2 plus 10, as the apparent speed was already starting to decrease, and in response to that, the first officer now lowered the nose. This sudden pitch down was observed by the tower controller, who now saw the aircraft almost leveling off before it eventually resumed its climb and disappeared into a layer of stratus clouds, which on that day stretched from about 900 to 3,000 feet. The captain had reacted to the lowering of the nose by asking, "What happens? It's not climbing," to which the first officer replied, "I am climbing, but the speed," trying to convey to the captain that he felt an impossible situation trying to chase the steadily decreasing airspeed without any apparent success. Now at this point, the tower controller also came into the picture saying, "Aeroperú 603 119.7, a standard call advising them to contact the departure controller, and to that, the captain just replied with 603 instead of a complete readback, and he also never switched over to the new frequency. This was likely a first indication of the mental load that the pilots now must have started to feel just about 1 minute into the flight. And actually, this was already the second call advising them of this requested frequency change. They had missed the first one since it had come just as they realized that their altimeters were frozen. Shortly after this, the captain must have suspected that the airspeed, vertical speed and altitude indication in the cockpit couldn't be trusted, because he now told the first officer to maintain a pitch attitude of 10 degrees nose up, thereby establishing the attitude indicator as the primary reference to control the aircraft, independent of the air data system. Now that was a great idea, because flying pitch and power is exactly what needs to be done initially to deal with this issue, and it would have likely saved the day if he had consistently followed it through. But that train of thought was unfortunately cut short just a few seconds later by the first officer, who now drew the captain's attention to an advisory message on the Boeing 757's ACAS, or Engine Indicating and Crew Alerting System. It read "Rudder Ratio" and was followed about 30 seconds later by another one reading "Mach Speed Trim." Now, to those of you who have watched my video about the crash of Bergen Air Flight 301 near Puerto Plata on the 6th of February 1996, about 8 months before this flight, these two advisories might sound a bit familiar. And that's because, in that case, they also played a significant role and were also connected to unreliable air data. You see, the rudder ratio system reduces the maximum available travel of the rudder as a function of increasing airspeed. And the reason for this is that at high speeds, a large input on the rudder pedals can generate enormous aerodynamic side loads on the vertical stabilizer, potentially enough to overstress or even fail the fin. The max speed trim system is an automatic stabilizer trim function, and its job is countering the so-called Mach tuck, which is an aerodynamic phenomenon that happens as the swept wing jet accelerates towards a higher Mach number, meaning a higher percentage of the speed of sound. As that happens, the center of lift on the wing moves slightly aft, producing a nose-down pitching tendency, or a tuck under, so this system automatically trims to resist that. Now, whilst these two systems operate in very different flight regimes, they both require reliable airspeed sensing to function properly. So when the airspeed of the captain and first officers disagreed by more than 10 knots for 5 seconds, which happened in this case since the static port blockage was slightly uneven, a discrepancy was flagged, triggering this rudder ratio and Mach speed trim advisories. Like I said, this had also happened to Bergen Air 301, and it is important to understand that these two advisories would not normally appear together, unless the air data system was corrupted. When the NTSB investigated the crash of Bergen Air 301, they recommended including this information in the operating manual to help pilots recognize an unreliable airspeed scenario, but the final report of Bergen Air Flight 301 was only published approximately 3 weeks after this flight had taken place. This therefore meant that instead of helping the pilots by confirming that the air data was unreliable, and therefore encouraging the captain to follow through on his idea of controlling the aircraft by using pitch and power, these advisories now did something completely different. The two pilots now latched onto each one of these messages individually in the hope that it would help them to identify what was wrong with their aircraft. And that caused them to miss what their almost simultaneous appearance really meant. So the 10 degrees nose up idea was quickly abandoned, and the first officer again started chasing the speed, which caused the nose to drop again. And in response to that, the captain soon called out, "Go up! You're going down," to which the first officer just replied, "I am up, but the speed." "Yeah, but it's stuck," answered the captain, returning to the correct train of thought until the ACAS advisories led him astray again. He now read them out aloud. Mach trim rudder ratio, temporarily interrupted by a call to his first officer to again, "Go up, go up, go up." At time 00:43 and 45 seconds, only about 2 minutes after the takeoff, likely where they were still in the clouds, the aircraft found itself at an altitude of around 2,000 to 3,000 feet above ground, which is only an estimate here since the altimeters were frozen. The captain now advised the first officer to start a turn to the right, heading out towards the Pacific Ocean, which again was a great idea since in theory at least there would be no danger of colliding with any rising terrain over the sea. At this point, the first officer decided to try and engage the autopilot, but the captain objected, saying, I don't think so. Let me see." But the first officer soon came back saying, "No command," meaning that he had likely tried to engage it anyway, but that it hadn't worked. And he then added, "The speed is better now." But whatever he meant by that, that feeling didn't last very long, because only about 3 minutes later he added, "Speed is 0, all speeds." Now, as all of this was going on, both pilots were still trying to make sense of the rudder ratio and Mach trim advisories, until the captain once more suggested, "The speed. Let's go to basic instruments. Everything has gone to shit." But instead of picking up on that and trying to sort out what was working and what was not, the first officer instead, on his own initiative, abruptly called up LIMA Tower, despite the fact that as pilot flying, that was not really his job. He now declared an emergency, which was answered by the tower controller with, "Roger, altitude?" To which the first officer continued, we have until 1,000 feet, it's approximately 1,700 feet." LIMA Tower then once more instructed them to contact departure control on 119.7, but the pilot still didn't do that for another 40 seconds or so. In any case, during the ensuing minutes, the pilots continued agonizing about the rudder ratio and Mach trim advisories, adding that an auto-throttle advisory had now also popped up, indicating that the auto-throttle system now didn't work either, which kind of makes sense given the corrupted air data. At this point, the captain formally took control of the aircraft and continued the climb, whilst the first officer finally called up LIMA departure on 119.7. However, when the new controller answered, the pilots didn't get back to him. Instead, they were now discussing whether the autopilot was engaged, with the captain believing that it was, and the first officer disagreeing. This argument was then repeated several times during the flight, and whilst the final report doesn't provide any information about whether the autopilot was working or not, it probably wasn't, and wouldn't have been a good idea to use either given the issue that they were facing. At this point, again without consulting the captain, the first officer requested radar vectors for an ILS approach back to runway 15 from the air traffic controller, with the captain objecting, "Not yet, let's stabilize." But the first officer just ignored him and didn't alter his requests, leading to the controller assigning them with a northwesterly radar heading of 330 degrees, and that was likely intended to bring them on a track parallel to the coastline about 30 nautical miles west of Lima. And the controller then asked them to maintain their altitude, to which the captain just responded, "Altitude? We can't, we're going up." Now at this point, the first officer again ignored his captain and asked air traffic control himself, "What level do we have? 4,000 feet? Let's see if you confirm us." And to that, the controller replied, "Correct, keeping 4,000. Completely unaware of the fact that by confirming this altitude, he and the first officer had now set a deadly mental trap, one that would have huge consequences. You see, the altitude information that was shown on the controller's radar screen was in fact as faulty as all the other air data derived indications from the aircraft's own cockpit. And that's because that altitude information came from the captain's altimeter and was then transmitted to air traffic control via the aircraft's transponder. Now, any one of the people involved here could have realized this, but the chaotic communications in the cockpit and the lack of training in unreliable air data scenarios meant that it now simply fell by the wayside, and instead, the information submitted by the controller became kind of a comfortable constant that the pilots could use to confirm their own faulty mental picture of what was going on. And to make things even worse, another unpredictable element was now also introduced. The adhesive tape covering the static ports was not completely airtight, and as the outside static pressure reduced as they climbed, a small amount of air from the trapped system now started slowly leaking out. This meant that the altimeter soon appeared to start working again, indicating an altitude of 4,000 feet. But as the leak was only allowing the trapped pressure to be released at a slower rate, the altitude indication was still incorrect, lagging behind and showing a lower altitude than they actually had. And despite this, the airspeed indicators initially remained frozen. And we know this because the first officer soon stated, "Speed is 0, all speeds," as the flight continued to climb on a southwesterly heading instead of turning northwest as advised by air traffic control. Something that again likely pointed to the high workload that was now present in the cockpit, where the rudder ratio and Mach trim advisories continue to drain the pilot's mental capacity. When the aircraft's apparent altitude reached 9,200 feet, air traffic control confirmed this to the pilots, continuing to play its part in this deadly chain of misunderstandings. At 10,000 feet, the captain then intended to level off, and the controller now informed the pilots that they were 30 nautical miles west of Lima, and he asked whether they still wanted to proceed towards the localizer for the runway 15 ILS approach. Now, again before consulting the captain, the first officer just answered, "Correct!" But the captain protested this, saying, "Not yet, let's solve the problem," to which the first officer just didn't reply. It is very hard for me to guess what was going on a crew resource management basis here between these two pilots, but it is possible that the first officer just wanted to get the aircraft down as soon as possible, and that the captain just elected to choose when he needed to assert his authority, because they obviously wouldn't have started an approach without him agreeing to it. And it is also possible that the workload and the fear in itself was playing a role in how the first officer acted here. In any case, air traffic control then gave them a new radar heading of 350 degrees, almost due north, in order to close the distance to the localizer, which was at this point still more than 30 nautical miles to the northeast. And after another discussion about whether the autopilot was engaged or not, which it wasn't, the captain finally leveled off at an altitude of 12,000 feet as indicated by his altimeters. Now, we can never be completely sure about what altitude they actually had at that point, but given the lagging static pressure reading, it seems plausible that they were actually a bit higher than that. It was now about 8 minutes after takeoff, and the leakage of the adhesive tape must by this point also have begun to affect the airspeed indicators, because the captain suddenly called out, "Okay, it's now showing the speed." And that prompted the first officer to inform air traffic control, "We're now recovering speed and request to maintain 12,000 feet. At this point, the captain had also realized that the flaps were still in the takeoff position, so he asked the first officer to retract them, whilst finally turning to a northwesterly heading as advised by the controller. So things now started to seem like they were getting more organized. The airspeed indicators showed a speed of 220 knots, and the captain again busied himself with attempts to switch on the autopilot and auto throttle. And together with the ensuing discussion of this, because it likely didn't work, this kept the pilots occupied for the next 1.5 minutes, until the controller interrupted them to provide more information about their speed. But of course, the speed that he had was not the aircraft indicated speed relative to surrounding air mass. Instead, it was their ground speed, resulting from a time-distance calculation by the radar equipment. The controller stated that their ground speed looked to be 310 knots, which given the altitude that they were at was not totally implausible. And to this, the first officer just replied, "Roger, we're at 12,000 feet, keeping speed." The next minute was then spent once more trying to resolve those pesky ACAS advisories, with the first officer referring to the operating manual, while the captain told him to read all of that. The first officer started by listing the now familiar rudder ratio, max speed, trim and autopilot auto-throttle advisories once again, reading from the manual in a quite disorganized way, as he tried to find his way around the table of contents, but still without finding any information that would help them to sort this out. Now, before I continue with this story, which will take another dramatic turn in just a few moments, I need to give you some more background information to help you understand the actions and reasoning of these two pilots as they tried to control an aircraft whose instruments had suddenly developed dementia. And for that, you have to understand how different controlling an aircraft is from, for example, driving a car. In a car, you can roughly estimate your speed by how quickly the landscape moves around you, but that is completely impossible in an aircraft. For one thing, most of the time the ground is just too far away to be a useful reference, but even if you were to fly extremely low, it would be impossible to determine your speed with any real accuracy. On top of that, as I've already alluded to, speed relative to the ground is not actually that relevant. For example, in a 100-knot headwind, which does happen sometimes, you could remain completely stationary relative to the ground in a light aircraft, while your speed relative to the surrounding air would still be 100 knots, which is what keeps you flying. And if you then reversed course, you would be scooting along at 200 knots relative to the ground, while your indicated airspeed would still only read 100 knots. So if your stall speed, which is where the wings stop producing lift, were 80 knots, you could actually fall out of the sky, whilst your ground speed would still indicate something just under 180 knots. Exactly because of this, the airspeed indicator is a vital instrument in any cockpit, whether it's a Boeing 747 or a Piper Cub. Now, that same principle also applies to altitude and vertical speed. It's not really possible to gauge your altitude or your rate of climb or descent unless you're very close to the ground. And even then, it takes considerable training to accurately hit the touchdown mark in a large jet when approaching a runway without instruments or external visual aids. In fact, even under visual flight conditions, pilots depend on their instruments to a certain degree, and in large commercial jet operations, these indications are absolutely crucial. Now, the more experienced a pilot is, the more accustomed they become to interpreting attitude, altitude, airspeed, and vertical speed from their scan of the instruments where all of this information is presented. And to illustrate just how deep this goes, picture a state-of-the-art full-flight simulator equipped with a 6-axis motion system that accurately replicates the aircraft's movements. Personally, I actually remember asking myself more than once when I've been instructing in the sim, is the motion switched on or did I forget it? Now, this subconscious coupling between indication and cessation becomes so strong that it requires tremendous concentration to override it consciously. And you could see that here when the captain instructed the first officer to maintain a 10 degrees nose-up attitude after takeoff. He was, at first, almost unable to comply. And that wasn't because he was a poor pilot, but instead likely because the erroneous airspeed reading sent an imperative subconscious message that the nose now had to be lowered regardless of the captain's instructions. There are basically only 2 remedies for this, and the first one is easy to say but hard to do without thorough training. It involves controlling the aircraft using references other than those normally used. In this case, this would, like I have already mentioned, have meant concentrating on parameters like the pitch attitude and the thrust setting, and basically ignoring all other air data indications which were giving erroneous data. The second remedy is actually a prerequisite for the first one. It requires a mindset where the pilots realize that this nightmare scenario demands a structured approach to working together and providing mutual support. And that would have required a clear cockpit hierarchy, with the captain establishing fly the aircraft as the absolute #1 priority and warding off all possible distractions until basic control was regained and maintained. It would also have involved establishing as a fact that the air data instruments were corrupted in the first place, and that, in order for them to survive, they would have to cooperate closely, supporting each other in breaking free from their dependence on those instruments. Now, these 2 pilots eventually tried to deal with all of these issues, but not in an organized way. They instead addressed them randomly and haphazardly and didn't continue to pursue them after distractions. And for the entire flight, they never really agreed on a sustainable strategy. And because they never really committed to ignoring the air data instruments, they also didn't realize that there actually was reliable information available to them. The Boeing 757's inertial reference system consists of laser gyroscopes and accelerometers who computes ground speed directly, independently of the pitot-static system. Like I said earlier, ground speed may not be a primary parameter as it doesn't indicate the speed relative to the air, but it is still better than nothing and can be used as a proxy to real airspeed, especially if you know the rough wind direction and velocity. So realizing that their ground speed was directly displayed in the cockpit rather than having to ask the radar controller for it would have likely been an extremely valuable insight. On top of this, some reliable height information about their altitude above the ground was also available through the help of their radar altimeter, which bounces radar wave information onto any surface below the aircraft and then measures the time that it takes to return. The radar altimeter normally doesn't show any indication above 2,500 feet, but in this case it would still have given valuable information as they got closer to the ground, and if they would have thought of using it. But the most important fact that these pilots failed to realize was that there actually was no real time pressure in this situation. Apart from the indications that depended on the static pressure, the aircraft was perfectly intact. There was more than enough fuel on board, it was a calm night with reasonably good weather and little to no air traffic, and ATC was providing radar service to inform them about their position. So this meant that there was ample time and airspace available to determine which indications to trust and to experiment with methods of controlling the aircraft using only pitch and thrust settings as references. And in fact, it would have been possible to devise a surprisingly accurate control regime based solely on those 2 parameters. But all of what I have just told you now is super easy to deduce in hindsight. So, although it is very frustrating to see how these two pilots responded, given their lack of training, it is actually completely understandable. And so was their fixation on their ACAS messages. Another thing that I haven't mentioned yet is something known as startle and surprise. Just try to think of how you reacted to the first time that someone jumped out from behind a tree to scare you. That's startle. And the continuation of that, if you're faced with a threat that you don't quite understand, is surprise. Both of which are not great when it comes to cool logic thinking and actions. Studies have shown that these responses actually also worsen when it happens at night or in any situation without outside visual references, and the responses in themselves are evolutionary leftovers from the time that our ancestors had to worry about things like saber-toothed tigers, where a fight or flight reaction was essential. But today, those same reactions produces mostly unhelpful side effects, like the release of adrenaline into the bloodstream, which leads to an elevated heart rate and blood pressure. But worst of all, they might result in impairments of cognitive abilities. Now, those effects fade away quite quickly if there is enough information available to identify the perceived threat as harmless, but in the case of these two pilots, that was definitely not the case, since the threat persisted and the situation remained unclear and ambiguous. The physiological and psychological stress caused in these situations can drastically degrade key competencies like situational awareness and management of information, which is exactly what we can see happening here. And on top of this, it's also super important that we look at these reactions in the context of the era when this flight took place. This happened over 30 years ago. And the detailed procedures for unreliable airspeed scenarios that all of us pilots use today were only developed after, and in large part because of events like this one. What this all means is that these pilots simply didn't have sufficient procedural or human factors training to adequately deal with what was being thrown at them. So, with that in mind, let's now get back into the cockpit and see what ultimately happened. The captain was at this point flying the aircraft, which he believed to be at an altitude of 12,000 feet. And at time 0051 and 58 seconds, about 10 minutes after the troubles had begun, the captain suddenly exclaimed, "Hey shit, we're going down now." It's not completely clear what had triggered this descent. It is plausible that it had already begun before the captain's exclamation, but it now meant that the adhesive tape, which had leaked during the climb, now gradually started closing that leakage due to the increasing pressure outside as the descent continued. But this time, it came with a much more serious consequence. You see, as this aircraft now descended, the pressure trapped inside of the system this time effectively remained equal to where it had been at the higher altitude, which again led to an erroneous altitude indication, only this time it would indicate too high. And this also explains why the initial descent was probably not noticed by the pilots. And on top of this, as the seal of the leakage gradually tightened with the rising ambient pressure, the lag in altitude indication increased, ultimately freezing the altimeters completely again, but now at a higher altitude value and not at ground level as it had been before. The airspeed indication was also affected in a similar way, meaning that it now started indicating a higher value the lower the aircraft descended. Like I said before, these type of failures can be extremely complicated and insidious. In any case, the result of all of this was that the pilots soon believed that they were flying more or less level, whilst in reality they were actually still in a descent, and their airspeed now indicated higher and higher values the lower they got, causing the captain to soon exclaim, "It can't be! Hey, the speed, look! The power we have, it just can't be!" He was again right. It couldn't be. But again, these pilots just didn't have the knowledge tools to process what was going on. For the next 30 seconds, they still tried to troubleshoot the air data system by switching the captain's air data instruments to the alternate source of the standby air data system. But since its static ports were also covered by the same adhesive tape, this didn't improve anything. When the captain realized this, he repeated the life-saving thought that he had voiced before. Basic instruments, let's go to basic instruments. And for the first time, the first officer finally agreed, repeating, "Basic instruments," to which the captain answered with a further insight that again could have saved the day. The air data is gone. Here. So once more, if they had just followed up on this insight that the air data was gone by methodically analyzing which indications they still could rely on, well then, they might have realized that they still had a working ground speed indication and a radar altimeter, and that the aircraft could be safely controlled using fixed pitch and power settings. But instead of methodically doing this, the first officer now busied himself with inserting the expected ILS approach into the flight management computer, while the captain tried once more to get the indications back, but obviously to no avail. The first officer seemed completely fixated on his idea to return to Lima as quickly as possible, using the perceived safety of an ILS approach with its reliable ground-based localizer and glide slope information to get down. That's consistent with the symptoms of cognitive impairments known as target fixation and tunnel vision, where a specific solution or instrument suddenly gets all of the attention to the detriment of other sources and ideas. The time was now 00:54 and 58 seconds, and the air traffic controller informed them that they were 37 nautical miles west-southwest of the airport, and upon hearing this, the first officer responded with a request. "You will have to help us in altitudes and speed if possible," which again exposed them to the treacherous altitude information provided by the controller's display screen, which was actually transmitted from their own faulty instruments. The captain now said that he wanted to descend down to 10,000 feet, but the lag in the altitude indication made it seem as if they were not descending at all, whilst their airspeed indication kept increasing. This prompted the first officer to again request speed information from air traffic control, who advised about a ground speed of 320 knots. To which the first officer replied that even though they had brought back the engines to idle thrust, the airspeed just kept rising, something that was obviously physically impossible, but again, easy to say from the comfort of my chair. For the next few minutes, the pilots tried to reduce their apparent speed, with the first officer advising the captain to deploy the speed brake, which he reluctantly did, but instead of this reducing the indicated speed, it just increased the sink rate, which in turn increased the indicated airspeed even more. About 4 minutes after that last communication, at time 00:58 and 37 seconds, air traffic control showed the aircraft position as 31 nautical miles west of the airport and informed them about a ground speed of 280 knots, while the cockpit indication now showed 350 knots. And because of that, about 30 seconds later, a loud two-tone horn overspeed alarm started sounding in the cockpit, and it would continue blaring to the end of the recording. Now, it has been proven extensively that a loud, repetitive warning that can't be silenced has a severely detrimental effect on cognitive performance. And unfortunately, at that time in the Boeing 757, there was no real way to quickly silence this warning. The only way to do that were for the pilots to locate and pull the associated circuit breaker on the overhead panel, but they had no capacity to do that. And to make matters even worse, the actual airspeed had now reduced so much, accompanied by an increase in the angle of attack, that the stall warning was also triggered, with the rattling noise of the stick shaker turning the cockpit into a complete madhouse. This meant that there were now two conflicting warnings competing for the pilot's attention: overspeed and stall, all whilst the airspeed indication rose even higher, while the altimeters stubbornly insisted that the aircraft was somewhere near 10,000 feet. Now, the captain miraculously managed to avoid the impeding stall, which was correctly indicated by the way, despite him arguing that the stall warning was fictitious. But the first officer came up with another idea. He now asked air traffic control to send up another aircraft to fly in formation with them and guide them down. Again, that idea had not been coordinated with the captain, who protested immediately, while air traffic control advised about a Boeing 707 that might soon be ready to be sent up. Now, I understand that this might sound like a great solution, but you have to remember that for untrained pilots to fly in formation with another airliner without working speed indication, that would be very risky for both aircraft. Not to mention that there was still a cloud layer in the area which would make it virtually impossible. So instead, the pilots now spent the next few minutes fruitlessly debating the stall warning, with the captain insisting that it was erroneous as everything else, while at the same time the first officer was desperately trying to find a way to silence the overspeed warning. This was then followed by another exchange with the controller, advising of their ground speed of 220 knots and an apparent altitude of 10,000 feet. And deceived by that, the pilots still followed their mental model, which insisted that they were flying more or less level, somewhere around 10,000 feet, with an aircraft that was somehow able to maintain its altitude and increase its airspeed, even though they had pulled the thrust back to idle. The first officer even called up air traffic control at this point and advised that we have engines cut down and it doesn't decelerate apparently. In the meantime, the increasing outside air pressure at the lower altitude that they were now at had completely sealed the leakage around the tape, meaning that the altimeters now froze at around 9,500 feet for the rest of the flight. And immediately after that, at time 0102 and 44 seconds, another warning was added to the chaos in the cockpit. And as if the stall warning had not been enough, the voice warning that now sounded should have triggered an instant response from the pilots, but it didn't. As some of you might have guessed, I'm talking about a warning coming from the ground proximity warning system, which is triggered by an algorithm fed by the radar altimeter. And it was therefore totally independent of air data and therefore very much real. But incredibly, this warning would now be allowed to sound in the cockpit for a full 45 seconds. And instead of reacting to it by firewalling the thrust levers and performing an aggressive pull-up maneuver, the captain just asked, "What's happening?" To that, the first officer replied, "Too low terrain," just repeating the word of the warning but without suggesting any remedy to it. Again, this might sound incredible, but I also kind of understand it. When you're inundated with several serious warnings, it would likely have been hard to discern which one, if any, was actually valid. And if you combine that with an altitude indication of 10,000 feet over the ocean, shown both on your instruments and confirmed by the controller, you can probably understand what I mean. This is why precise system knowledge is so important. The captain now initiated a turn to the left as the terrain warning might have introduced some kind of mental map shift in his head, causing him to believe that he was actually over some type of terrain instead of over the ocean. The first officer then called air traffic control, informing them about the terrain warning, to which the controller responded that his radar still showed them at 10,000 feet over the ocean, turning to the left. "We have terrain alarm and we're supposed to be at 10,000 feet, responded the first officer, seemingly starting to doubt the information for the first time, but before the controller could respond to that, a wind shear warning started to sound in the cockpit as well. Now, in the Boeing 757, this particular warning is disarmed above 1,500 feet radar altitude, but it was now dutifully rearmed by the radar altimeter since the pilots had managed to descend to below 1,500 feet without realizing it. And that was something that the earlier terrain warning also indicated and would have been shown on their radar altimeter. Now, the wind shear warning in itself had once again been triggered by the corrupted air data information, just like it had immediately after takeoff, but it did provide yet another hint of their actual situation. But that hint was unfortunately soon followed by seemingly reassuring information from the radar controller, who again said that according to his monitor, they were still maintaining 10,500 feet. Now, the timing of that radio call was truly horrific. It really shut the door to the crew regaining some positional situational awareness, and instead of checking the radar altimeter, the first officer now responded to the controller saying, "We have all of the computers going crazy here." Now, although the captain had not reacted correctly to the earlier terrain warning, he must have inadvertently climbed slightly above the waves and thereby silenced it. So, still unaware of how close to disaster they were, the pilots now just continued discussing their position and confirming with air traffic control that they were 42 nautical miles west of Lima, over the water, heading west-southwest, now actually away from the airport. Their indicated airspeed still read 370 knots, whilst ATC informed them about a readout of 220 knots ground speed with a decelerating tendency, to which the captain now responded, "Shit, we will stall now?" And that revelation probably led him to slightly lower the nose, which quickly resulted in a new GPWS
Sink rate.
warning, which
Sink rate.
now sounded
Sink
4
rate.
times.
Sink rate.
The first officer had
rate.
meanwhile started to feel a bit uncomfortable and responded to this new GPWS activation by saying, "Let's go up, let's go up here." 4 seconds later, the captain asked him whether he was interfering with the controls in some way, to which he replied no twice, and he then added, "Let's go up a little bit to see." To which the captain replied, yeah, I am." So after having again narrowly avoided impacting the ocean without knowing it, they now climbed to an altitude that was later estimated to be about 4,000 feet. Now I know some of you will ask now, didn't they see anything? But the answer to that would have likely been no. It was in the middle of the night over the ocean, and they kept going in and out of clouds. The first officer now tried once again to address the advisories shown on the ACAS system, seeking further information from their paper documentation, but as before, he couldn't find anything convincing him to stop trusting the altitude and read back from air traffic control, which at time 0109 and 36 seconds, about 7 minutes after the first terrain warning, was once again reaffirmed as 9,700 feet, with a ground speed of 240 knots and a distance of 51 nautical miles to Lima. This meant that the captain once again initiated a descent, which again increased the apparent indicated airspeed, prompting him to ask, how can it be flying at this speed if we're descending with all the power cut off? But rather than taking that discussion, the first officer, as he had done so many times before, just asked the controller about their altitude again. This time, before the controller even had a chance to answer, the
Too low terrain
warning came back, and shortly after that, the controller repeated his altitude readout of 9,700 feet, and he then asked, "What is the indicated altitude on board? Have you any visual reference?" 9,700, but it indicates too low terrain. "Are you sure you have us on radar at 50 miles? The first officer answered. And by that time, the terrain warning had been sounding for more than 10 seconds, again without any reaction by the captain, and it will continue for another 28 seconds. Meanwhile, the pilots just continued discussing the abnormally high airspeed reading, and the first officer eventually suggested that they should extend the landing gear, to which the captain replied, "But what do we do with the landing gear?" But the first officer never had a chance to explain that, because at time 0110 and 59 seconds, the left wing smacked into the sea surface with a speed of 250 knots and a left bank of 5 degrees. The first officer now transmitted in panic, "We are impacting the water," to which the controller responded, go up, if it indicates, pull up." But with its left wing now likely severely damaged, the aircraft only managed to climb to an altitude of 300 feet before it rolled into a left bank of about 70 degrees and finally hit the water with a speed of 250 knots and a nose-down attitude of 5 degrees. And all 61 passengers and 9 crew members on board perished immediately on impact. An immediate search and rescue operation was initiated, and a few weeks after the accident, the US Navy, which had responded to a call for assistance by the Peruvian authorities, pulled a piece of the left side of the fuselage up from a depth of about 600 feet. And it contained the 3 left-hand static ports, which were found to be still covered with the metal-colored adhesive tape that had been used for the cleaning. On top of this, the flight data readout from the cockpit showed that at the time of impact, the captain's altimeter was reading 9,500 feet with an indicated airspeed of 450 knots. And although the other parts of the fuselage containing the rest of the static ports was never recovered, the final report concluded, based on the flight data and voice recorder transcripts, that those ports must also have all been blocked. Now, when Robert, who helped write this episode, explained his view on this accident to me, he added the following points. Almost every professional pilot has probably looked at a photo of this piece of fuselage at least once in their career, and I remember the flight safety seminar where I first saw it. I have read the voice recorder transcripts of this flight numerous times, and every time I read it, I'm struck by just how many times a door opened up that could have led the pilots out of the mental tunnel that they were in. This makes me think of what a very experienced airline flight instructor once told me. Teaching them how to fly an airplane is not hard. It is the way they think up there that makes the difference. Now, in the aftermath of this, the Bergen 301 and other similar accidents, the industry have learned a lot. We now all train our pilots in how to recognize and recover from an unreliable airspeed event, not only when we have one blocked source, but also with multiple ones. And on top of actual tables showing us what pitch and power to use in order to fly the aircraft down to a safe landing, the following golden rule is also being hammered in. Aviate, navigate, and communicate, in that order, and heartbreakingly, the captain in this story was only moments away from doing just that. Now, this was again a collaborative effort by my team and I, who now consist of around 15 full-time, hard-working, wonderful people. And 2 of them are Andrew and Nassault, who are working as full-time simulator pilots for our episodes. And in this episode, you might have noticed the incredibly detailed Boeing 757 model that we used. And I just want to give a huge shout out to BlueBird Simulations, who gave us early beta access to their model. You should definitely check it out when they release it, because it is awesome. Now, if you are a simulator pilot out there and you want to take your simulator flying to the next level of realism, you should definitely check out Ben's and my virtual Boeing 737 course, which you can find via the link below or with this QR code. These are some testimonials that we have received from the thousands of people who have already tried it, and we are very proud of it. So if you want to try it as well, then use the code MENTORPILOT for 20% off the full price for the next few days. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.